Tell me the maker of that skillet, and it goes in my case with his name on it.
A diner cook. Guessing at real craftsmanship, this should be entertaining.
Get it right, and it's yours, officially, under a real name. Get it wrong, and it goes on my list with the others.
What list is that?
Structurally unsound. Like most things men like you try to hold on to.
Roscoe Finch made this. Last batch the foundry ever poured. I've known that since I was 10 years old.
That's an awfully specific story for a line cook who flips eggs for a living.
I didn't need to flip eggs to learn this. I had somebody better than a title. I had the man who built the mold.
To understand why that answer changed the whole shape of her face, you have to understand what my son and I were about to lose before either of us knew there was anything to lose at all. My name is Curtis Boone, 41 years old, and most mornings you can find me running the kitchen at a diner called the Heartwell Griddle. The kind of place where the coffee is bad on purpose because nobody complains about bad coffee that costs $1. Cooking was never really a career plan for me, so much as a place to put both hands and let my head go quiet. Something a man taught me a long time ago, that some of the best things a person learns never get written down anywhere. My son Dean is 8. Every time he finishes a dish, even scrambled eggs on a Tuesday, he narrates the last 30 seconds of it like a cooking show host, invents a dramatic name for whatever is in the pan, and says the same 4 words before he lifts the lid to show me. And now, the reveal. I used to think it was a phase he would grow out of by 2nd grade. He is starting 3rd grade in 3 weeks, and it has only gotten more elaborate. My wife Holly died 3 years ago. Fast. The way an aneurysm takes someone fast. On an ordinary Tuesday that started with her making Dean's lunch and ended in a hospital hallway before dinner. I keep most of that day to myself these days. Less out of avoidance than out of wanting Dean to inherit his own memory of her rather than mine. One careful story at a time, so it stays hers and not just mine. He still keeps her reading glasses on his nightstand. He has never once asked why. Holly used to say the diner suited me because it let a quiet man be useful without ever having to explain himself out loud, and she was probably right about that more than I gave her credit for at the time. She waited tables at a different place across town when we met, and used to tease me that I fell in love with her order pad handwriting before I ever fell in love with her, which was not entirely untrue. After she died, the kitchen became the one place I could still stand for 8 hours straight without my mind going somewhere I did not want it to go. And Dean learned early that if he wanted to talk to his father about something serious, the stove was usually a safer place to start than the dinner table. We had a routine by then, Dean and I, worn smooth the way routines get when 2 people build them together out of necessity rather than choice. Tuesdays I closed the diner early and we cooked together at home, something new every week, mostly because Dean insisted a real chef needed a rotating menu, even if his audience was one tired father and whatever stuffed animal currently outranked the others. It was during one of those Tuesday dinners, months before any of this started, that Dean first asked me why I always checked a pan with my thumb before I checked anything else about it. I told him a man taught me that once, a long time ago, and that I would tell him the whole story when he was old enough to sit still for it. I did not know yet how soon that promise was going to come due. My own father, Sam Boone, worked the floor at Hartwell Ironworks until it closed in 1979, then took a job in a hardware distributor's warehouse because a man with a young family does not get to be picky about which building he walks into every morning. He died there in a forklift accident when I was 3 years old. I do not remember him. What I have instead is his best friend, a pattern maker named Roscoe Finch, who showed up at our door within a week of the funeral and never really left again. Roscoe had spent his whole working life at the foundry, carving the wooden patterns that molten iron gets poured around. Patterns for cookware, for machine parts, for anything the plant ever cast. He was the best pattern maker Hartwell Ironworks ever employed, and when the foundry shut its doors for good, he kept one skillet from the very last batch it ever poured, a plain black pan nobody else wanted, and never told anyone exactly why. When I turned 10, Roscoe started teaching me to feel the difference between a piece cast from a hand-carved pattern and one stamped out by a machine. He would set 2 skillets in front of me, nearly identical to the eye, and make me run my thumb around the inside of each one with my eyes closed. A machine repeats itself, he told me once, setting his own hand flat on the counter between us. A person's hand never repeats itself exactly, not even his own. Some things are known by hand before they are ever known by name. I did not understand what he meant that first year. I understood it a little more every year after. Roscoe never had children of his own, and after my father died, he treated the empty chair at his kitchen table like it had always belonged to me. He taught me to read a casting, the way some men teach a son to read a box score, patiently, on Sunday afternoons, never rushing past a question I asked twice. When he died 11 years ago, at 84, the lawyer handling his estate called to tell me he had left me exactly one item by name in his will. The last batch skillet. Nothing else, no explanation attached, just my name and the pan. The trouble started this summer, not because I went looking for it, but because the Hartwell Griddle got hired to cater the town's cast iron heritage night, a fundraiser for a new museum meant to celebrate the old foundry before every trace of it disappeared for good. I decided, half as a joke and half out of pride, to cook the whole spread in nothing but skillets from the original foundry, the ones I had spent 15 years collecting and restoring on weekends. I set up my demonstration table right beside the museum's intake table, where donated pieces were being logged for the new collection. I did not know yet that the woman running that table had spent 20 years making sure certain pieces never made it that far. Beatrice Colfax had managed the Sturgis family's private collection since 2006. Hired as a consultant after Adelaide, Sturgis inherited it from her father, who had inherited it, in turn, from Elias Sturgis, the man who once owned the entire foundry. Beatrice knew cast iron the way an appraiser is supposed to know it, by paperwork, by provenance folders, by a trained eye that had grown very good at telling museums exactly what they needed to hear. What she was actually running, underneath 20 years of polite consultation, was something closer to a slow, careful theft. The bell over the museum's side door was still ringing behind the last volunteer when Beatrice set my skillet down and gave me her offer in front of half the room. The stakes were not really about who owned the pan. It was already mine. What Beatrice was actually offering was a place in the museum's opening exhibit. I learned only later from the museum director that the case near the entrance still had one slot open for an unnamed hand-cast piece, and that Beatrice clearly meant to fill it, one way or another, before the night was over. I said Roscoe's name out loud, and for 1 second her whole careful face slipped, and then it did not slip again for a long time. Adelaide Sturgis found me in the parking lot afterward, 69 years old and moving faster than her cane suggested she should, and asked if I would sit with her a moment before I loaded up my van. She had watched the whole exchange from a folding chair near the door, and something about it had bothered her enough to come find me instead of just going home. She told me her grandfather Elias had run that foundry for 3 decades, that she had inherited what was left of his collection back in 1995, and that she trusted Beatrice completely, right up until the moment she watched Beatrice's face do something she had never seen it do before, over a plain black skillet a diner cook had brought in as a prop. I told Adelaide what Roscoe once told me, about hands never repeating themselves, and she wrote his name down on a napkin like she wanted to remember it later. She told me, almost as an afterthought, that her grandfather Elias had rarely talked about the foundry after he sold it, except once, near the end of his life, when he told her the men on his floor had been better craftsmen than half the museum curators who would one day try to explain their work to strangers. She had never known what to do with that sentence until tonight. Neither of us understood yet how much that napkin was going to matter. "I've trusted Beatrice with my family's whole legacy for 20 years, Adelaide said, folding the napkin carefully into her coat pocket. I would like to be wrong about what I just saw. Would you help me find out? Either way, I told her I would, mostly because it felt like the kind of promise a man owes to anyone who has just watched something in her own life crack open a little. Whether or not either of us yet understood how deep the crack actually ran. 3 days after Heritage Night, I stopped by the museum's temporary office to ask a simple question: whether Roscoe's tools or any of his personal effects had ever been donated alongside the collection. The volunteer at the desk pulled a binder of donation records without much interest and let me flip through it while she took a phone call. What I found instead was a page listing pieces excluded from the collection over the years, each one marked with the same clipped phrase in Beatrice's handwriting. Structural compromise, not fit for display. 7 entries in 20 years, every single one an item a hand-carved pattern would have produced, and not one machine-stamped piece on the whole list. I copied the 7 entries into my phone before the volunteer got off her call, catalog numbers and dates, and drove home with a feeling I did not have a name for yet. Something between curiosity and the specific unease of noticing a pattern nobody was supposed to notice. Hartwell is a small enough town that everyone still calls the foundry site by its old name, even though nothing has stood there since the buildings came down in the early 90s, replaced now by a gravel lot the county uses for surplus equipment. I drove past it on my way home that night, the way I had 1,000 times without really looking, and for the first time in my life, I found myself picturing what it must have looked like. Full, 6 days a week. Molten iron and men who knew each other's hands well enough to recognize a piece of work without ever checking a name tag. My father had walked through that gate every morning for years before I could remember him doing it. And Roscoe had walked through it for over 2 decades after that. And somewhere in between the two of them, a piece of that place had ended up in my kitchen without my ever fully understanding how much history it was actually carrying. That night, after Dean was asleep, I went looking through a box of Roscoe's old papers I had kept in the garage since his death. Mostly out of sentiment, rather than any real plan to read them again. Near the bottom was a photocopy Roscoe had made himself, decades ago, of an old foundry inventory sheet, listing every piece from the final batch of 1979 by a private code only the pattern makers used. 6 pans total, mine included. I matched the codes against the museum's exclusion list and found one that lined up almost perfectly. A skillet logged as destroyed for scrap in 2019 under a company name I did not recognize. Curious, I searched the company online and found almost nothing. A single listing with no working phone number and an address that turned out on the map to be a storage unit facility. Then on a whim, I searched the catalog number itself, the private code stamped into the metal that only a pattern maker's records would ever explain. It surfaced once, buried in a private auction listing from 2 years after its supposed destruction, sold to a collector overseas for a price that made me sit back in my chair. Something that had allegedly been melted into scrap in 2019 was, in fact, sitting in someone's private kitchen in another country in 2021, looking exactly the way a hand-cast Hartwell skillet was supposed to look. Sleep did not come easily that night. Roscoe's voice kept circling back through my head, patient as always, telling me that a person's hand never repeats itself exactly. I had spent 15 years learning to hear that sentence as a compliment about craftsmanship. It had never once occurred to me it might also be a way of catching a thief. Lying there in the dark, the whole shape of it finally arranged itself into something I could not unsee. A hand-cast piece gets written up as structurally compromised, a hairline crack that might be real and might have been made with a small tool nobody thought to check for. The board votes to exclude it from the collection in the name of preservation, almost without discussion, because nobody doubts a consultant with 20 years of trust behind her. Over a photograph nobody has looked at in decades, the piece gets handed to a scrap buyer for proper disposal, a company that, on paper, melts it down for good. And somewhere, outside all of that paperwork, the actual piece survives, cleaned up, sold years later at its true worth to a collector who never asks where something with no documented history actually came from. The Hartwell County Historical Society kept its records in a converted farmhouse on the edge of town, staffed 2 afternoons a week by volunteers who mostly answered questions about cemetery plots. I went in the following Saturday and asked if they had anything from the old ironworks, expecting nothing more than a few framed photographs. Instead, a volunteer led me to a locked file cabinet and pulled out a notebook I recognized before she had even finished setting it on the table. Roscoe's handwriting on the spine, donated by his estate the year he died, a detail nobody in my family had ever mentioned to me. The notebook ran from 1955, the year Roscoe started as an apprentice, straight through to 1979, the year the foundry closed. Every entry described a mold in his own private shorthand, the shape and depth of the gate mark, the particular rhythm of thickness across the base that made his patterns identifiable to a trained thumb even decades later. The final batch got a full page to itself, 6 pans, 6 sets of measurements, and along the bottom edge, squeezed in later in handwriting gone shaky with age, 6 words that stopped me cold. One for Sam's boy, when he's old enough to understand. I sat in that farmhouse for close to an hour, cross-referencing every measurement against the feel of my own skillet, my thumb finding each detail exactly where Roscoe's notes said it would be. Some things are known by hand before they are ever known by name. I had believed that sentence my whole adult life as something true about craft. Sitting there, with proof in ink and proof under my own thumb, agreeing with each other perfectly, I understood for the first time that it was also true about people, that I had known who to trust in that museum long before I had a single piece of paperwork to back it up. I asked the volunteer if anyone else had ever come looking at this notebook. She checked a sign-in sheet and told me a woman had requested it 2 years earlier, spent less than 10 minutes with it, and never came back. The name on the sheet was Beatrice Colfax. That was enough to confirm the shape of what I was looking at, but not enough to prove it to anyone who had not spent 15 years learning to trust their own hands the way I had. I drove home turning it over, knowing that tomorrow I was expected at the museum to help catalog the very collection at the center of it, and that I still had no idea how deep the 7 missing pieces actually went, or who besides Beatrice might already know exactly what I had found. I remembered from a conversation years earlier at the diner counter that a woman named Pearl Higgins used to work quality inspection at the foundry before it closed, and had briefly helped Beatrice with the Sturgis collection afterward. I found her number through a regular customer and called on a Tuesday afternoon. She was polite and firm, and told me she had nothing to say about Beatrice Colfax to a stranger over the phone, and hung up before I could explain why I was asking. I drove out to her place the following weekend anyway, a small house on the edge of town with the garage door standing open, and found her sanding down an old oak dresser under a bare shop light, sawdust settled into the creases of her hands. She did not look surprised to see me, only tired in a way that suggested she had been half expecting somebody to show up eventually. "You're the diner cook with the skillet," she said, still running the sanding block along the grain. "Word travels fast in a town this size." "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said. "I just want to understand what happened to some pieces that used to belong to the Sturgis collection." She set down her sanding block and looked me over slowly, the particular look of someone deciding whether a stranger has finally earned the right to be talked to. "I spent 3 years cataloging pieces for that woman," she said. "Good work, careful work. Then one day she told me my eye for detail had gotten sloppy, and that was that. No warning, no severance, just a phone call telling me not to bother coming back Monday." She pulled off her gloves, finger by finger. "I've had 17 years to wonder whether sloppy was the real reason." "Was it?" I asked. "No," she said simply. And for the first time since I had arrived, she looked directly at me instead of at the dresser. I think I noticed something I wasn't supposed to notice. I just didn't have proof of it back then. I only had a bad feeling and a job I couldn't afford to lose over a feeling. She did not hand me anything that day and did not promise she would testify to anything if it ever came to that. But she told me, before I left, that she still had boxes in her garage she had never gotten around to sorting, and that if I ever found something worth showing her, she might finally be curious enough to go looking through them herself. 2 days later, a museum volunteer mentioned, half in passing while we set up folding tables for an upcoming donor preview, that Beatrice had scheduled a formal condition assessment for the following week and specifically requested my skillet be brought in early for review, ahead of the other new donations. Something about the word early sat wrong in my stomach the whole drive home. I kept thinking about 7 entries in 20 years, all marked the same way, in the same handwriting, and about a pan with my father's name written into it by a dead man who was no longer around to defend what he had made. That night I made a decision I still cannot fully defend, even knowing everything I know now. I drove to the museum's storage annex after hours, using the after-hours access code I had been given as a catering vendor for a completely different purpose, and took my own skillet off the shelf where it had been logged in as a temporary donation 2 days earlier. I brought it to a metallurgist, 2 counties over the next morning, a man named Dale Prescott who examined estate pieces for insurance purposes, and asked him to tell me plainly whether anything about the pan looked structurally unsound. Dale spent 20 minutes with it under a bright lamp, turning it slowly under a magnifier, tapping the rim once with a small metal probe and listening to the ring it gave off. "Clean tone," he said, mostly to himself. "You get a duller sound out of a piece with real fatigue in it, something a decent appraiser learns to hear inside the first minute." He set the probe down and looked up at me. "I don't see cracking. I don't see fatigue, and I've been doing insurance assessments on estate pieces for 22 years. Whoever wrote otherwise about a piece like this either does not know cast iron, or did not want to." "Would you put that in writing?" I asked. "I already did," he said, sliding a typed page across the table. "Cost you $80 and about the same in gas money to get out here. But yes." I thanked him and folded the page into my jacket, feeling, for a short while in his cramped little office, like the hardest part might already be behind me. I felt for about an hour like I had solved something. Then I got the call from the museum director asking why my skillet was missing from the storage annex, and I understood, all at once, that I had just handed Beatrice Colfax the only weapon she actually needed. I told the director the truth, that I had removed it myself without authorization to have it examined because I was worried about a report I had not yet seen written. It sounded, even to my own ears, exactly like something a guilty man would say. Beatrice, when she heard, did not raise her voice or accuse me of anything directly. She simply noted, calmly in front of the board's preview committee, that a piece with an unclear chain of custody could no longer be trusted for the exhibit, regardless of what any outside metallurgist claimed about it, and regardless of what I said my intentions had been. I thought I had found the beginning of an answer that week. What I had actually found was the beginning of a much longer fight, and I had just given the other side the first real advantage of it. For a week, Beatrice made sure I could not get anywhere near the collection. The museum director, a careful man named Roger, who clearly did not enjoy being caught between a consultant with 20 years of history and a caterer with none, told me apologetically that until the chain of custody question was resolved, I was not permitted in the storage annex, not permitted at the cataloging sessions, and not permitted for the moment to display my skillet at the opening at all. I spent those evenings at the kitchen table with Dean, doing homework across from me, trying to explain, in language an 8-year-old could hold on to, why I had done something that looked, on paper, exactly like the thing I was accusing someone else of. "You didn't steal it," Dean said, not looking up from his worksheet. "It's already yours. That's not the same thing." He said it so plainly and so certain of the difference that I sat there for a full minute without answering him. It was Dean, oddly enough, who reminded me what I still had. He asked one night whether Roscoe's notebook was the only proof I had, the way he might ask whether a recipe only worked with one specific pan. I told him no, that there might be more, and realized as I said it that I had never actually gone back to the Historical Society to ask what else Roscoe might have left behind beyond that single notebook. I called the archive the next morning and learned that the Historical Society had, in fact, received a second small donation from Roscoe's estate years earlier, a folder of loose photographs nobody had ever properly catalogued because it had been filed under a different collection by mistake. Sitting in that folder, unlabeled, was a photograph of the final batch of skillets laid out on the foundry floor the day they were cast. All 6 of them, with Roscoe's own handwriting on the back listing which pan he intended for which person. It named my father. It named a foreman. It named, to my genuine surprise, Elias Sturgis himself, who had apparently kept one for his own family, the very piece Adelaide had grown up believing was simply an old kitchen pan of unknown origin. That photograph sat entirely outside Beatrice's reach, donated by a dead man to an archive she had visited exactly once, 2 years earlier, and apparently not thoroughly enough. Adelaide called an emergency meeting of the museum's preview committee for that Thursday, insisting, over Beatrice's objection, that I be allowed to attend as a guest. The room was small, a converted classroom in the community center. Folding chairs arranged in a loose circle. 6 board members, Roger the director, Beatrice with a leather folder of her own reports, and Adelaide sitting closest to the door like she wanted a clear path if she needed one. Beatrice spoke first, and spoke well. She laid out calmly and at length the chain of custody violation, the after-hours access, the missing skillet, the metallurgist's report I had commissioned myself, which she described, not unfairly, as something I could have paid for regardless of what it actually showed. Then she turned to Pearl Higgins, whose name I had mentioned once, weeks earlier, to Roger in passing, and suggested that a former employee let go under difficult circumstances 17 years ago made an unreliable source for anything, let alone an accusation against the woman who had managed this collection faithfully for 2 decades. By the time she finished, 2 of the 6 board members were nodding along and Roger was looking at his hands. Mr. Boone clearly has strong feelings about a family heirloom, Beatrice said, closing her folder. I understand that. But strong feelings are not documentation, and a man who removes evidence from a locked facility at night is not, in my professional opinion, the person this committee should be trusting to tell them what belongs in a public exhibit. One of the board members, a retired postal worker named Frank, who had known Beatrice for a decade, cleared his throat and asked whether it was really the committee's place to weigh in on a personnel dispute between a caterer and a consultant, rather than simply moving forward with the exhibit as planned. Another board member nodded along, glancing at her watch, clearly hoping the whole matter could be settled quickly enough to still make it home for dinner. I felt the room tilt toward her the way a room does when everyone in it has already half decided something and is only waiting for permission to say so out loud. Adelaide stood up before I could speak and set her grandfather's leather-bound notebook on the table between herself and Beatrice, the same notebook her grandfather Elias had kept, listing the best pattern makers who had ever worked his floor. A book that had sat in a cedar chest in her attic for 30 years and had never once been logged as part of the official Sturgis collection. I found this 3 weeks ago, going through my mother's things, Adelaide said. My grandfather wrote a line about Roscoe Finch in 1962. He called him the only man on the floor whose work he could identify, blind, by feel alone, without ever seeing the stamp. She looked directly at Beatrice. You've spent 20 years telling this board what my family's collection is worth. I'd like to know why you never once mentioned that my own grandfather already told us in his own handwriting exactly which pieces mattered most, and why every single one of them somehow ended up marked structurally unsound on your watch. Nobody in that room said anything for a long moment. Beatrice reached for her folder again, and her hand, for the first time all evening, was not quite steady. The door at the back of the room opened before she could speak again, and Pearl Higgins walked in, 74 years old, a canvas bag over one shoulder, looking like she had aged a decade in her mind just to make herself come. Adelaide had called her that morning, after finding the notebook, and asked simply, whether she would be willing to say what she knew to people who might finally listen. Pearl set a folder of her own on the table, thinner than Beatrice's, and opened it without being asked. I photographed every piece I logged for Beatrice. Between 2006 and 2009, Pearl said. Habit from the plant. You do a thing before you sign off on it, so nobody can say later you missed something. She slid a stack of photographs across the table, dated in her own careful hand along the bottom edge. Every piece on her exclusion list is in here, whole, clean, not a crack on any of them. The same year, she claims she found the damage. I kept these because getting let go without much explanation makes a person careful about keeping records of her own. Roger, the director, took the photographs and set them beside Beatrice's condition reports, comparing dates that were only months apart, and told a story neither set of paper could tell alone. I stood up then, with the printout I had made from the auction listing, and set it beside both folders. This is the catalog number stamped inside the last batch Skillet donated for scrap in 2019, I said. And this is the same number, on the same style of pan, sold at a private overseas auction 2 years later, after it was supposedly melted down. The company that certified the destruction has no listed phone number and shares an address with a storage unit facility 2 counties from here. Adelaide looked at Beatrice for a long moment before she spoke again. My grandfather's notebook tells us which pieces mattered, she said. Pearl's photographs tell us they were whole when you first saw them, and Curtis found where they went after you said they were gone. I don't need a 4th piece of paper to understand what happened to my family's collection for 20 years. For a moment I thought she might try one more angle, the way she had tried Pearl's credibility and my chain of custody violation, some third target left in the room to redirect everyone's attention toward. She looked instead, briefly, at Frank, the board member who had spoken up for her minutes earlier, and seemed to understand, from his face alone, that whatever loyalty he had offered her a moment ago had already quietly changed hands. Beatrice did not raise her voice, and did not deny any of it outright. She said only that the board would need time to review everything properly, gathered her folder with hands that no longer quite matched her voice, and left before anyone could ask her another question directly. I thought that was the end of it. Beatrice proved me wrong 3 days later, in a way that had nothing to do with folders or committees. Dean came home from school with an envelope in his backpack, addressed to me, forwarded through the front office because it had arrived for a student rather than a parent. Inside was a letter announcing that Dean had been selected for a community recognition scholarship, along with a check made out in his name from an organization called the Heartwell Founders Legacy Fund. The letterhead looked official enough that the school secretary had not thought twice about passing it along. I had never heard of the Heartwell Founders Legacy Fund, and neither had the school. A quick search turned up a registration filed 9 years earlier, with a business address that traced back to the same building as Beatrice's consulting office, and an officer of record whose name I recognized from one line buried in Pearl's photographs, a maiden name Beatrice had not used publicly since before she started working for the Sturgis family at all. It took me a day to see what the check actually was. Not a bribe, bait. If it cleared with my son's name on it, every word I had said in that committee room became the testimony of a man whose family had taken her money, and the review that was supposed to end her career would end mine instead. I did not cash the check, and I did not let Dean keep it. I told him, as plainly as I could manage, that sometimes adults try to make a problem go away by handing a child something shiny, and that the right thing to do with an offer like that is hand it straight to someone whose job it is to say no on your behalf. He asked if this meant he was in trouble. I told him it meant exactly the opposite, that he had done nothing but be 8 years old and open his own backpack, and that the only person who needed to explain herself now was a grown woman who should have known better than to try. He chewed on that for a moment, working it over the way he worked over most things I told him, slowly and out loud. So she was trying to buy us, he said finally. Like buying a pan you already know isn't worth what the price tag says. I told him that was about as close to the truth as an 8-year-old was ever going to need to get. and he seemed satisfied enough with that to go finish his homework, though he brought the subject up twice more over the following week, each time circling a little closer to actually understanding it, the way he circled most things that mattered to him before he let them settle. I gave the letter and the check to Adelaide, who gave them to the museum's attorney, who gave them, within the week, to the county's Consumer Protection Division. What followed was not dramatic. Nobody put handcuffs on Beatrice Colfax, and the local paper never ran her name above the fold. Beatrice's consulting contract with the Sturgis family was terminated within days. Her state licensing board opened a formal review of her appraisal credentials, the kind of process that takes months and ends quietly, on paper, the way most real corrections to a life like hers actually do. The salvage company sharing an address with a storage unit 2 counties over came under investigation once county records connected its filings to a name that matched no registered scrap dealer anyone could find. Adelaide told me later that 4 of the 7 pieces on Beatrice's exclusion list were eventually traced and recovered, still whole, from private collections willing to cooperate once they understood what they had actually purchased. The pan from the overseas auction came home first. The collector, it turned out, wanted no part of the story now attached to it. The other 3 remained missing, filed as open cases with an investigator who promised nothing except that the file would not be closed. Adelaide told me she had stopped thinking of those 3 as lost and started thinking of them instead as simply not yet found, a distinction Pearl agreed with completely, and one I found myself more and more applying to other things in my own life that had once felt permanently gone. The Hartwell Cast Iron Heritage Museum opened on a Saturday morning in late September, 6 weeks later than originally planned, with a single case near the entrance holding 6 skillets from the final batch the foundry ever poured. Roger had tracked down 2 more of the 6 over the summer, one from a Sturgis cousin who had no idea what she owned. One donated anonymously in an envelope with no return address, and had them cleaned and mounted beside mine, Adelaide's, and the 2 others already confirmed. A small brass plaque beneath the case read simply, Hartwell Ironworks, Final Pour, 1979, patternmaker Roscoe Finch. Dean wore a collared shirt he had picked out himself for the occasion, and spent the first 20 minutes of the opening narrating the exhibit under his breath to anyone standing near him, the way he narrated everything, until a museum docent noticed and asked, kindly, if he wanted to say a few words to the small crowd gathered near the case. He glanced back at me across the room, a question on his face, and I gave him a small thumbs up instead of an answer, which seemed to be all the permission he actually needed. He walked up, cleared his throat the way he always did before a reveal, and said, "This pan was made by a man named Roscoe Finch, and now and then, in our house when we're done cooking with the last one he ever made, my dad still checks it with his thumb before he checks anything else." Then grinning, unable to help himself even at a moment like that one, he added, "And now, the reveal," and gestured at the case like he had personally arranged for it to exist. Roger found me near the refreshment table afterward and admitted, quietly, that he had spent most of the summer worried he had mishandled the whole situation, letting Beatrice run the preview committee for as long as he had before anyone thought to question her numbers. I told him most people do not go looking for a pattern until somebody hands them a reason to notice one, and that I had needed a dead man's notebook and a bribe mailed to an 8-year-old before I fully believed my own eyes either. He laughed at that, a short, relieved sound, and told me the museum board had already voted to bring Pearl on as a part-time collections consultant, this time with her name properly on the paperwork. An older man near the front, a retired history teacher who had been asking questions all morning, turned to me afterward and asked, half joking, whether I could actually tell the difference between a hand-cast piece and a machine-stamped one just by touch, the same way people had asked all my life, usually not expecting a real answer. I picked up the display copy set out for visitors to handle, a later production piece with no history attached to it at all, and ran my thumb once around the inside without looking down. "Machine made," I said. "No gate mark variation. Edges too even." Somebody could tell you the difference on paper. I'd rather just feel it. And the ones in the case? He asked. I did not need to touch them again. I had spent 31 years learning them by feel long before I ever needed to prove it to a room full of strangers, ever since a man with sawdust always somewhere on his shirt decided a fatherless boy deserved one more person willing to be patient with him. Roscoe Finch made every one of those, I said. Last batch the foundry ever poured. 1979. I've known that since I was 10 years old, and I know it a little more every year I get to keep saying his name out loud instead of just knowing it quietly by myself. Adelaide, standing near enough to hear, smiled at that in a way that had nothing left in it of the wariness she had carried around Beatrice for 20 years. Tell me the maker of that skillet and it's yours. She laughed. The single dad ran a thumb inside. That single sentence had started it all, back at the intake table on Heritage Night. A woman laughing because she was certain no diner cook could possibly know what she was holding. I think about it differently now than I did that evening. Less as a dare I happened to survive, and more as the moment I finally understood what Roscoe had actually left me. Not just a pan, but a way of trusting my own hands enough to stand still in front of somebody who wanted very badly for me to doubt them. That evening, after the crowd had thinned and Dean had fallen asleep in the car on the drive home, I sat at our kitchen table and gave him the second skillet, a smaller one Roscoe had cast years earlier from the very same pattern he had used for the last batch, kept back for practice, and later handed down to me along with the larger one, though I had never told Dean that until now. I set it in front of him the next morning at breakfast and watched him run one uncertain thumb around the inside the way he had watched me do 100 times without ever once being told why it mattered. Some things are known by hand before they are ever known by name, I told him. The way Roscoe once told me, setting my own hand flat on the table between us. You don't have to understand a thing yet to start learning to trust it. I didn't. Not for years. I just kept my hand on it until I did. He turned the little pan over twice, feeling its weight, its edges, the faint variation only a real hand-carved pattern ever leaves behind, and did not ask what it meant. Not yet. Not the way he usually did. He just nodded slowly, set it down between us like something worth being careful with, and said quietly that he thought maybe he already understood a little, and that the rest of it, he figured, he had plenty of time left to learn. He cooked with it that same afternoon. Nothing complicated, just eggs and a little butter. And when he finally lifted the lid to show me, he did not launch into his usual production the way he had 100 times before. He just held it out toward me, steady, and waited, like he already understood that some reveals do not need 4 words attached to them to mean something. I told him it looked exactly right, and meant it in more ways than he was probably old enough yet to hear. Some evenings, closing up the diner alone after Dean has gone to a friend's house, or fallen asleep in the back booth over his homework. I still run my thumb around the inside of that first skillet before I put it away for the night. Less out of habit now than out of something closer to gratitude, for a man who spent 30 years teaching a boy who was not his own son that some kinds of proof were never meant to live on paper at all, and for a boy of my own who is slowly, patiently, learning the same lesson by hand, exactly the way it was always supposed to be taught.